Hi, sorry about that. Technical difficulty, but we're back at it. So he had just encountered a fat guy at the bar, and he asked him, how do you get fat? And the fat guy told him how to get fat. That's basically where we are. Okay. And with that advice, the fat man launched himself out into the dark tide of night, swaying mightily and wheezing. That's exactly what Dr. Burleigh told me. Slightly changed, said Harris thoughtfully. Perhaps that trip to Phoenix now at this time. The trip from Los Angeles to Phoenix was a sweltering one, crossing as it did the Mojave Desert on a broiling yellow day. Traffic was thin and inconstant, and for long stretches there would not be a car on the road for miles ahead or behind. Harris twitched his fingers on the steering wheel. Whether or not Creldon and Phoenix lent him the money, he needed to start his business. It was still a good thing to get away, to put distance behind. Actually, pause that. I'll be right back. It's going to take you just a minute. I got to go attend to something. Okay, sorry about that. Let me make sure we're on. Yes, okay. The car moved in the hot sluice of desert wind. The one Mr. H sat inside the other Mr. H. Perhaps both perspired. Perhaps both were miserable. On a curve, the inside Mr. H suddenly constricted the outer flesh, causing him to jerk forward on the hot steering wheel. The car plunged off the road into boiling sand and turned half over. Night came. A wind rose. The road was lonely and silent. The few cars that passed went swiftly on their way, their view obstructed. Mr. Harris lay unconscious until very late he heard a wind rising out of the desert, felt the sting of little sand needles on his cheeks and opened his eyes. Morning found him gritty-eyed and wandering in thoughtless, senseless circles, having in his delirium got away from the road. At noon he sprawled in the poor shade of a bush. The sun struck him with a keen sword edge, cutting through to his bones. A vulture circled. Harris' parched lips cracked open. So that's it, he whispered, red-eyed, bristle-cheeked. One way or another you'll walk me, starve me, thirst me, kill me. He swallowed dry burrs of dust. Sun cook off my flesh so you can peek out. Vultures lunch off me, and then you'll lie, grinning with victory, like a bleached xylophone strewn and played by vultures with an ear for odd music. You'd like that. Freedom. He walked on through a landscape that shivered and bubbled in the direct pour of sunlight, stumbling, falling flat, lying to feed himself little mouths of fire. The air was blue alcohol flame, and vultures roasted and steamed and glittered as they flew in glides and circles. Phoenix. The road. Car. Water. Safety. Hey! Someone called from way off in the blue alcohol flame. Mr. Harris propped himself up. Hey! The call was repeated, a crunching of footsteps, quick. With a cry of unbelievable relief, Harris rose, only to collapse again into the arms of someone in a uniform with a badge. The car tediously hauled, repaired, Phoenix reached. Harris found himself in such an unholy state of mind that the business transaction was a numb pantomime. Even when he got the loan and held the money in his hand, it meant nothing. This thing within him, like a hard white sword in a scabbard, tainted his business, his eating, colored his love for Clarice, made it unsafe to trust an automobile. All in all, this thing had to be put in its place. The desert incident had brushed too close, too near the bone, one might say, with an ironic twist of one's mouth. Harris heard himself thanking Mr. Creldon dimly for the money. Then he turned his car and motored back across the long miles, this time cutting across to San Diego so he would miss that desert stretch between El Centro and Beaumont. He drove north along the coast. He didn't trust that desert, but careful. Salt waves boomed, hissing on the beach outside Laguna. Sand, fish, and crustacea would cleanse his bones as swiftly as vultures. Slow down on the curves over the surf. Damn, he was sick. Where to turn? Clarice? Burleigh? Munigant? Bone specialist? Munigant. Well? Darling, Clarice kissed him. He winced at the solidness of the teeth and jaw behind the passionate exchange. Darling, he said, slowly, wiping his lips with his wrist, trembling. You look thinner. Oh, darling, the business deal? It went through, I guess. Yes, it did. She kissed him again. They ate a slow, falsely cheerful dinner, with Clarice laughing and encouraging him. He studied the phone. Several times he picked it up indecisively, then laid it down. His wife walked in, putting on her coat and hat. Well, sorry, but I have to leave, she pinched him on the cheek. Come on now, cheer up. I'll be back from Red Cross in 3 hours. You lie around and snooze. I simply have to go. When Clarice was gone, Harris dialed the phone, nervously. Munigant? The explosions and the sickness in his body after he set the phone down were unbelievable. His bones were racked with every kind of pain, cold and hot, he had ever thought of or experienced in wildest nightmare. He swallowed all the aspirin he could find in an effort to stave off the assault, but when the doorbell finally rang an hour later, he could not move. He lay, weak and exhausted, panting, tears streaming down his cheeks. Come in, for God's sake! And Munigant came in. Thank God the door was unlocked. Oh, but Mr. Harris looked terrible. And Munigant stood in the center of the living room, small and dark. Harris nodded. The pains rushed through him, hitting him with large iron hammers and hooks. And Munigant's eyes glittered as he saw Harris' protuberant bones. Ah, he saw that Mr. Harris was now psychologically prepared for aid. Was it not so? Harris nodded again, feebly, sobbing. And Munigant still whistled when he talked. Something about his tongue and the whistling. No matter. Through his shimmering eyes, Harris seemed to see Munigant shrink, get smaller. Imagination, of course. Harris sobbed out his story of the Phoenix trip, and Munigant sympathized. The skeleton was a traitor. They would fix him for once and for all. Mr. Munigant, sighed Harris, faintly. I never noticed before. Your tongue. Round, tube-like. Hollow. My eyes. Delirious. What do I do? And Munigant whistled softly, appreciatively, coming closer. If Mr. Harris would relax in his chair and open his mouth. The lights were switched off, and Munigant peered into Harris' dropped jaw. Wider, please. It had been so hard that first visit to help Harris with both body and bone revolt. Now he had cooperation from the flesh of the man anyway, even if the skeleton protested. In the darkness, Munigant's voice got small, tiny, tiny. The whistling became high and shrill. Now, relax, Mr. Harris, now! Harris felt his jaw pressed violently in all directions, his tongue depressed as with a spoon, his throat clogged. He gasped for breath. Whistle. He couldn't breathe. Something squirmed, corkscrewed his cheeks out, bursting his jaws. Like a hot water douche, something squirted into his sinuses. His ears clanged. Ah! Shrieked Harris, gagging. His head, its carapaces riven, shattered, hung loose. Agony shot fire through his lungs. Harris could breathe again, momentarily. His watery eyes sprang wide. He shouted. His ribs, like sticks picked up and bundled, were loosened in him. Pain! He fell to the floor, wheezing out his hot breath. Lights flickered in his senseless eyeballs. He felt his limbs swiftly cast loose and free. Through streaming eyes he saw the parlor. The room was empty. Munigant, in God's name, where are you? Munigant, come, help me! Munigant was gone. Help! Then he heard it. Deep down in the subterranean fissures of his body, the minute, unbelievable noises, little smackings and twistings and little dry chippings and grindings and nuzzling sounds, like a tiny, hungry mouse down in the red-blooded dimness, gnawing ever so earnestly and expertly at what might have been, but was not, a submerged timber. Clarice, walking along the sidewalk, held her head high and marched straight toward her house on St. James Place. She was thinking of the Red Cross as she turned the corner and almost ran into this little dark man who smelled of iodine. Clarice would have ignored him if it were not for the fact that as she passed, he took something long, white, and oddly familiar from his coat and proceeded to chew on it, as on a peppermint stick. its end devoured. His extraordinary tongue darted within the white confection, sucking out the filling, making contented noises. He was still crunching his goodie as she proceeded up the sidewalk to her house, turned the doorknob, and walked in. "Darling," she called, smiling around. "Darling, where are you?" She shut the door, walked down the hall and into the living room. "Darling." She stared at the floor for 20 seconds, trying to understand. She screamed. Outside in the sycamore darkness, the little man pierced a long white stick with intermittent holes, then, softly sighing, his lips puckered, played a little sad tune upon the improvised instrument to accompany the shrill and awful singing of Clarice's voice as she stood in the living room. Many times as a little girl, Clarice had run on the beach sands, stepped on a jellyfish, and screamed. It was not so bad, finding an intact gelatin-skinned jellyfish in one's living room. One could step back from it. It was when the jellyfish called you by name. Skeletons by Ray Bradbury. A suitably spooky story for a spooky season. Thank you for hanging in there, especially with the brief technical difficulty. We recovered a lot better this time than the last time it happened. But I'm going to go ahead and sign off for the night. It's getting a little later than I had anticipated, and I'm sure I'm due for an earful as soon as I get to the other room. So thank you again for listening. If you haven't yet and you're interested in hearing more spooky stories, I do make highlights of past broadcasts. You can listen to old episodes. And if you subscribe to the channel, you'll get an email from Twitch letting you know when we go live so you can catch the next stream. Once again, thank you very much for listening.